So we came to you after, I mean, we know each other for a bit longer. Some of the others met you at the Global Peter Drucker Forum, and some others I recommended your book to. And so I assembled a group of people who are not only great musicians, but who think about classical music differently than it has been set up. And for us, especially with COVID going on, the question is, how does classical music look like in the future?
Yeah.
It's lovely that you're mute, Alex.
Yeah. I've never been in the future, so you're going to have to tell me. So I think the interesting thing that we can have a conversation about is, none of us have been in the future, so none of us really knows what's going to work, right? And what I help corporations do around the world, and to a certain extent startups, just because we put our tools out there, is how to shape ideas and how then to test them. And that is how we need to approach the future, actually, admitting we do not know if it's going to work, right? And by actually admitting that none of us knows how the future is going to work, and then testing and adapting our ideas, that's the safest way to come up with really cool stuff. So maybe I'll actually just quickly draw something here. So I'll try to see if I can make this work. So if I go here, the foundation of inventing the future is very simple. You start with ideas, right? So you might have an idea of a different setup for classical music, a venture, or just, even in an individual setting, how you want to, interact with music lovers, right? So you start with an idea, and you're going to try to turn this into something real. In my world in business, it's about, if in particular talking about large organizations, it's about building a real business. So I'm going to draw here kind of a building, like with flags, a real big business. But it's the same thing if you're talking about an idea for one, right, for one person show, one woman, one man show, turning it from an idea here into something real. This is I'll call it a real business or a real kind of project. Sometimes we think it's a very straight line. We go from this to this. In the business world, that's how it was treated for a very long time. So in the business world, people would write a plan, a so-called business plan, and it would always have, a projection that would go like this, right? Revenues or users or customers, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody would think, okay, how are we going to execute this plan? Because we really drew out how this idea is going to look like. But the reality is, if you have a plan and then execute it, you're actually very likely to maximize your risk of failure, because you've never been in the future. You don't know if this plan is going to work. But in the corporate world, we like to make everything look like it's going to work. So people make PowerPoint presentations. But the reality is, any new idea, when we go when we start from an idea, we need to admit that we have no clue. Actually, it's important to admit you have no clue. So what we say here is risk and uncertainty.
Yeah.
When you're exploring a new idea, risk and uncertainty is very high. And you don't know if it's going to work. So rather than spending a lot of time on refining the idea, you admit, I don't know, but I have a process to test my idea. And all you're going to do, your only task when you do something new is to reduce risk and uncertainty. Reduce risk and uncertainty, not to immediately try out the idea. Now, let me give you a silly example. Let's say you have a new format in mind to deliver classical music, right? And you don't know if it's going to work, if people are going to like it. So what if you started to just go out and talk to, potential, either music lovers or sponsors, whoever your kind of customer base is, and you start to talk to them about your idea. And then they will tell you, that's a stupid idea. But that's okay, because what you just learned is, if you talk to 10 people and they all said, let's say sponsors, right? they all said, there's not a chance I'll give you a single, you know, dollar or euro or whatever other currency, because we're never going to invest in this. You just learned what not to do. Okay. So I'm going to change my idea. I'm going to adapt it. Now I'm going to, you know, talk to them. So I actually just crossed out. I learned what not to do, but I learned it very cheaply, simply by talking to 5 to 10 different people. So you go to your next thing. Let's say, oh, I'm going to deliver, I'm going to make up a silly idea, right? I'm going to deliver music through this new kind of experiential iPad app, whatever, or iPhone app. Who cares? I'm not going to build the iPhone app. I'm going to do something, maybe a video that makes this seem real, and I'm going to show it to sponsors. Again, they're going to say, well, I don't think I would sponsor that, but I would sponsor something else. So you failed again, but you know, you learned what to do. So you constantly iterate your idea and test it as cheaply as you can. And I'll show you in a bit. There's a book we wrote called Testing Business Ideas, where we help people figure out how to quickly test ideas without actually building or launching anything. And basically, the principle there is very simple. You test very cheaply, and the more you've tested, the more you actually reduce the risk of building something nobody wants or launching a project that nobody wants, and you're reducing the risk. So gradually you get closer to a real idea that could work. So that's the principle. And it doesn't matter if you are in music, if you're in building a business, or if you're in an impact project. It doesn't matter if you are, you know, a organization of one person, your individual business idea or your individual project, or if you're 1,000 people. It's exactly the same logic. So this is basically the principle of any type of innovation, except that you have no clue if it's going to work, and then immediately ask, how could I test this as cheaply and as quickly as possible? And you do that as much as you can. And the more you learn, the more you adapt your idea, and it becomes something that could really work. So what I like to say is, ideas are easy. They're everywhere. We all have great imagination. What is hard is to adapt the idea until you have what we call a value proposition that customers care about. So you really create value for customers. In your case, it might be sponsors, it might be people who are listening to the music, right? Creating value for them. And then the next one is embed it in a business model that could work. So if you're launching a bigger project, but even, you know, at the scale of one, you always, or you're going to need a business model that could work. Could be based on sponsors, or could be based on paying customers. So that's kind of the overall. And then we could even dive into the 2 tools we use to shape our ideas, which is the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas. So that's kind of the principle of de-risking the future, because we've never been there, right?
That sounds fantastic. What I would love, Alex, if that's okay with you, is to actually take some of the ideas people here are working, and they probably are actually a bit further down the line already, and see how we can then probably progress that to the next step.
Sounds good.
Cool. Then, Sean, I mean, you do these crazy videos playing Paganini with a GoPro camera, seeing your fingers. Now, you had tell the idea, pitch the idea, what's the next step to actually grow that and make money out of that?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. So as Bernard said, I have a crazy series where I film with a GoPro on my head, myself playing these incredibly virtuosic works. And the question that I'm trying to reconcile is, you know, how do I turn this into something that is profitable? And there are a few things that come to mind. One is reaching the point of getting YouTube revenue, because the videos are hosted on my channel. The bigger thing that has started to materialize a bit is concert engagements that come out of this very unusual program of performing the complete caprices. And then there's another question of how to take this and generate some sort of revenue, possibly directly from the audience, because in a sense, at the moment, it's so indirect. And you know, I was really inspired when I read, well, in your book, the model of the iTunes Music. I was surprised that even on such a mass scale, that Apple was primarily earning from iPod sales, actually not music sales. Like, to me, that was a shock. I never would have thought that. So in terms of testing out the idea, it becomes tricky because some of that is so roundabout. You know, it's am I gaining followers on social media and attention and exposure that indirectly translates into a program that presenters will want to present and count on, you know, audiences tuning in or showing up, and also it's such a mystery to me when I look at other people who are very active on these platforms. How much are they making? You know, because and that's a question that I'd be really curious to ask you, because you know, you have a lot of information looking at these businesses. You know, whether it's looking at their revenue information, and some of which you don't have access to, and a lot of which you do. If you have any advice for, you know, finding out what that looks like for other people who might be trying something similar in this new digital age, and just seeing if that's something to really go after, or to just kind of consider it as more peripheral.
So first question is, have you kind of captured all the different ways that you're imagining to monetize this cool creative idea? Have you kind of captured that somewhere, like in a business model canvas, or just in a list where you put up all those ideas?
Yep, I put them on a canvas. Yep.
Okay. So the first thing I would suggest is to look at what you think, you know, conceptually could make most money, right? So you just ask, what do you think could work best, and what would be the most interesting thing to explore first? So you just start with, you don't know if it's going to work, and then you ask, well, what needs to be true for this thing to actually work? And then you go and figure out, how could you test this? So one of the ways of testing is simply doing what we call desk research, right? So you go and look at YouTubers out there, because there are a ton, and they're actually sharing quite a lot. And I can even give you, there's a channel that I followed a little bit, I'll send a link after this, where there are two guys actually who depict YouTubers and how they make money, creators, right? They call it the creator economy. And they show that it's very hard to make any kind of revenue. They show for them with, I don't know, a couple of million views over a certain amount of time, yeah, how hard it is to earn money from advertising. So you need to be in the multi-millions to views to really make money from the advertising. Even that is pretty hard. So they will show you that, right? So there's something to learn there. So you just do desk research, look at the creators community, and you get a ton of information. They're very open, pretty open about this. Most of that money is actually made with product placement and sponsorship. That's how they can make some money, right? Product placement and sponsorship, and that develops over years. So that is one aspect, right? So you could explore that idea. Then, you know, you said another interesting thing. Maybe it's more about using this as an acquisition channel. So if we take the business model canvas, we're just in the acquisition channel, and you're saying, okay, what is the value proposition I want to sell through this increased visibility that I can get? And then you can start to experiment. Let's say, I don't know, you want to, what would you like to sell from more visibility? Let's say you can't make them out, if you couldn't make money directly through YouTube, through your channel, but you get a lot of visibility. What do you think is the most interesting thing you would like to sell from the increased visibility?
Probably this specific program. Yeah, in performance, that is. Yeah.
Right. So then you start to look at, okay, what would need to be true for me to sell this program based on increased visibility through YouTubers, right? First assumption you're making is that the people who would buy this program from you actually consume your YouTube channel, right? It sounds kind of trivial, but we don't always make the link, right? So sometimes people think, oh, more visibility, great. I'll give you an example from my world. We actually have quite a few, YouTube followers. I have quite a few followers on social, but the people who we sell to are CEOs and senior leaders of large companies. They don't use any of those social channels. So our entire visibility doesn't matter, right? So you already have to, again, it's a trivial thing. You need to look at, does that increased visibility through YouTube, do you even reach the people who would pay you for those programs, right? And you might think that, but it's just to make the system explicit. What would need to be true for you to sell through this increased visibility on YouTube, sell these programs? Well, basic assumption that people you're selling to are even using that channel. And it's just that kind of thinking that you want to use. So it's always back to this question, what would need to be true for my idea to work? More followers, right? Number one, the followers that I'm reaching actually are interested. And then those people who come on board, the next thing you would test is, do they have a budget for the kind of program that you're looking, to sell? The next one would be, how much are they actually willing to pay for something like that? All of those things you can test. How many of these things have you tested so far?
Let's see. I would say none of them so far. I have a lot of homework to do. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. And it's exciting, right? Because I think we spend too much time, and this goes for all, I'd say, when we start out, we spend too much time on our idea rather than saying, there's a fundamental question that we need to answer. What needs to be true for my idea to work? We go and test that. Based on what we learned, we adapt, right? So it's always a back and forth. We call that, it's kind of a double loop. You go through the design. What do I want to do? How can I test it? Oh, I tested this, right? The little drawing I made. I just realized, that's not going to work. I changed my idea, but it's always back and forth. So we tend to overthink it rather than do, learn, change, do, learn, change, do, learn, change. Entrepreneurs, innovators in their head, they always go through this double loop. So maybe I'll just quickly share this double loop so you kind of see how it looks like. See if I can do this elegantly and relatively quickly. So the double loop looks like this, where actually, let me go here. The drawing I made is from idea to real business, right? So that's the process I showed you. And I kind of scribbled out that we need to reduce uncertainty. And basically, it's always the red and the yellow. And what you just told me is you did quite some thinking on the red part. What could I sell and how could I reach more people? How could the business model look like? But you just told me right now, well, I didn't test that much. So you need to go quickly through this double loop. You ideate, you kind of make a business prototype, a business model canvas. You ask if that could work, but then as fast as you can, you go to the yellow loop. And the yellow loop is, what needs to be true for this idea to work? We call this, as a sophisticated way, we call it a hypothesis. You immediately go and test that. Desk research. You just asked me, okay, could I make money from advertising? I just told you no. I'm going to give you a reference where you can learn about that. Okay, experiment, desk research. Probably advertising is not going to work. What did you learn? I can get traction. I can get a lot of people, but I can't earn money. Okay, what does that mean? Well, maybe I'm going to use this traction and visibility for something else. Back to the red loop, right? So you go through this all the time. And that's kind of how you de-risk your ideas. and you quickly get to something that could work. So this is just a way, you know, to show what's going on in an innovator's and entrepreneur's brain. You go through red and yellow all the time. Shape idea, test idea, shape idea, test idea. It's not like I shape an idea and then I test for 12 weeks. No, no, no. Every day you go through red and yellow, red and yellow. There's black and yellow, but this is red and yellow. I don't know if anybody understood my joke, but.
So if you do that every day, yeah, you say, and if I might switch over to Rosalind, who is building an opera house in Lagos, yeah, and already has built up an orchestra. Rosalind, how can you go through this loop every day? What do you need from that? How do you do that?
So from what I understand, yeah, we would go to sort of a journey of, I think we're in the testing phase, and I saw in your book to keep not just reinventing, but to keep what's the word? To keep rewriting my business model. And I think that comes from the testing, right?
Correct.
If you keep testing, then you keep adjusting so
Correct.
that you're not stagnant, and you understand how to reinvent yourself as an organization. Yeah. So for us, what we would need, I believe, is as musicians, okay, you test with what? Let's say with concerts, for instance, if you have a concert series, right? And we are our love mark and our value proposition sort of fit together. This is what it would be on our side. Am I right, Bernhard? It'll be sort of the love mark will give you some of your value proposition to understand what the client, to understand what's valuable for the client. And so our programming, our concert duration, our concert format, our ticketing pricing, right? This would be what we're testing. Am I correct in
Yes.
getting our business model going properly, so we can get the sponsors and tell them this is what we've tested, this is what we've accomplished, and this is where we're going, and we're sure of it. I mean, at the beginning we weren't sure, but slowly it's coming. Yeah.
So yes, there's a danger, and you're actually you're kind of falling into the trap that most people fall into when they start testing, right? Okay. You're using the most expensive form of testing, which is putting up a real program, right?
Yes.
You know, making a real concert.
Yeah.
And I'll put the extreme case, right? So imagine if we look at this, that's why I'm bringing up this drawing again, right? So here, we're already down here. It's a very expensive experiment, okay? Yes. If you fail, and it's not gonna happen, but just imagine nobody shows up. Okay, you learned from that, right? But it's kind of an expensive adventure. So the question is, rather than waiting to do the real thing, which is the ultimate test, it's always the ultimate test. I'm doing the real thing.
Yeah.
Are there things you could do before that are cheaper? And I'll give a simple example, a pricing experiment, right? So if you don't know yet, what is the right ticket price? Maybe there's a way you could test to figure out the right ticket price. So I'm just taking a random thing, right? But you need to figure out what's the most important thing you need to test. So I'll give you an example, what we did in a completely different space, right? With my organization. When the pandemic hit, we had to go all virtual. And we had no clue, we have this workshop series, we had no clue how much would people pay for a virtual workshop. In the physical space, they paid $2,000 for 2 days, okay? So that's a reference point in the physical world. In the virtual world, remote workshops, we didn't know. So what we did is, we tested 3 price points, 1,900, 1,600, and 1,300. And I'm not saying this is the kind of experiment you need to run. I'm just showing you how we did it, okay?
Yeah.
So, whoops. So what we did is, we said, we're gonna test these 3 price points. And in our case, we have people coming to our website, and we sent 1/3 of all of the traffic coming to our website, we sent them to this price. We sent the second third to this price, and another third to this price. And then we looked at we would actually just get them to sign up with their email. So all they needed to do is give us their mail, okay? But what we could see now is the conversion rate, everybody who visited this geez, sorry, that was not supposed to happen. Everybody who visited at this price, at how many would convert? Oh, and I don't remember the numbers, right? We'd say, okay, 20% convert at this price. Then here, anybody who saw this price, we saw, oh, 15% would convert and sign up with their email. And for this price, we would see something like 16%. So we would learn which price point would have the best conversion rate. Conversion rate means people coming to my website and then actually signing up. And the surprising thing was, something we could have never learned by just asking people, is that the highest price had the highest conversion rate. There's no chance on earth you could figure that out without actually testing it. So logically you'd say, oh, that's the best, that's the price where we're going to attract most people. Turned out we would get a bigger conversion rate at the highest price. And we did this without having built the masterclass. We didn't even have the outline. We just said we're converting our virtual one, our physical one, to a virtual one. So we tested without knowing anything. If we had completely failed and nobody signed up, we could have stopped immediately, and the only cost of this would have been to actually do the experiment. So what I want to say with this is that the most expensive way to test is to do the real thing, right? Launch a concert, you know, get the sponsors involved. And that's not wrong, but that comes later on when you already kind of adapted. So you always need to ask, this is for all of you, you always need to ask, what's the cheapest way I can learn without building the real thing, without launching the real thing? And that is something that, you know, by far, not all innovators do. It's actually a very expensive mistake to build a thing. And a lot of first-time entrepreneurs make that mistake. They even raise money, and then they wasted, you know, $2 million or so building something nobody wants. We now know how to test cheaper. So there's the fundamental question, what needs to be true for my idea to work? And then you ask, what's the cheapest way to learn without building or launching the real project? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And I love your project.
Thank you.
Now we have two people here who actually have launched festivals online, and one is the festival we are actually talking about, the nexTus festival, which has been launched without much testing, Miroslava. Perhaps you can give a quick introduction, and let's see where this takes us. Brad, you had a question?
I just had a very brief question about the experiment, which I found fascinating. Did you tell them that, you know, after the test, obviously, that it was just a test? And how did you deal with the, you know, price differences?
So absolutely. So our philosophy is always to be transparent, right? To always tell them this was an experiment. In a test that we did a couple of years ago, we were selling an online course. We even reimbursed the people who paid more. And the principle behind that was that, look, they're going to figure it out, and nobody feels good about paying more when the price is lower afterwards. So we said, we're going to pay those people back who paid the higher price. Those who got a lower price, they got lucky, right? So we didn't ask them for more money because they wouldn't come back, right? But the principle is always be transparent. And you can then also, sometimes, you know, you say it's an experiment, and offer them something, right? Give them a discount for something you're already doing. Give them a discount if you launch the project. But the principle is always to be extremely transparent with the experiment. So telling them that this was an experiment. And I can guarantee you, maybe I shouldn't guarantee, but the assumption is very high that they're going to love it. People love being part of experiments from my experience, right? So it's very rare. You might get the one exception where people say, you guys, you tricked me, but it's extremely rare. And I work with a lot of corporations. So we in those cases bring in legal so we don't get into any kind of liability trap. But in general, you know, you don't even need a legal thing to do that. Just be straightforward, transparent, and people will love it.
But it meant that for this particular experiment, you already had a product that was a real product.
No, well, in the past, we had a physical masterclass, but the people who we were addressing haven't even been at the physical masterclass. So there was nothing, right? So we did not have a virtual setup. I think we might have said it's 3 half days. So I do think we gave them a little bit of structure, but it was basically, you could almost say a PDF, right? So the way we like to often experiment is say, how can you make something real that you don't want to build? A PDF document, just saying what it is, what are you going to get, is real enough, right? You could make a spec sheet, you know, oh, it's a concert, 4 hours, you know, 10, 20, 100 musicians, whatever. That works. If you want to go to the next level, you make a video that makes it feel real, but not of the real thing, but something where you show the journey. There's another technique, and if you Google it, you might find it. I'm not sure if we posted something. There's one that's called value scenes. With 3 drawings, you can sketch out a solution, or storyboards. With simple drawings, you can make it feel real. And that's already better than just talking about things. So another kind of just fundamental thing I'd emphasize in the testing, don't ask what people want, right? Show them, you know, always go for the facts. Ask, when's the last time you spent money on this type of, you know, event? When's the last time you Googled, you know, online classical concert or so? So always go for facts. Don't go for, would you buy this? Do you like this? Because all you'll get is opinions. And then if it's something new, you go for the jobs, pains, and gains. You know, do you actually even, you know, think about classical music? You know, when's the last time, the last, you know, 360 days that you even thought about, you know, digital classical music or so? So always go for the facts. That's the #1 thing. We have the tendency to ask, do you like this? Would you? Worst thing possible. Never go for that. Always go for facts. And when you present something, you know, ask, okay, in your context, how would this work? You know, does this feel real? Would you struggle with this? You know, make sure you connect it as much as possible back to facts.
Thank you. Miroslava.
Thank you, Bernhard. Yes, so as some of my colleagues were already talking about their projects, I was of course thinking, as you were describing, the cheapest way to test. And like Bernhard mentioned, we went the most expensive route. We launched in a way, though I have to say that in retrospect, we launched the festival after having discussed it in the community, so there was a big interest. It grew out of our community, BYOM community, so there was a lot of support. We did talk to people, we did take the temperature before we got to work, and there was a lot of interest actually leading into it to launch a festival physically. So when we decided to launch it online, we decided to jump right in and use the momentum. So my question at this point would be more about how valuable it is to use the momentum, because we saw the opportunity to connect people and to offer something while there's still quarantine happening and people are interested in online content. However, now that I'm looking at the statistics, the latest statistics seem to be going on more in a way to where the observations are that online content, especially in classical music, by established companies like opera houses and concert halls, are using it more for promo materials rather than actually selling content. So on one hand, we have something that we launched, and we're providing this platform for a community to present themselves, to present our artists. On the other hand, we're looking how to move forward from the presentation online and what would be the best way to strategize it.
So just a quick question to understand. So you're asking if it would make sense to launch this digital experience, you know, to use the momentum. You haven't done so yet. Is that correct? Just so I don't.
No, we already launched. We're actually in our first week of presenting. This is a ready product. And this session is actually a part of it. This was part of the innovation that we have included into it, because in all honesty, it is not done. This is one of the biggest purely online festivals that we have launched. So we're very proud of what we have created. However, monetizing wise, it is still not a mystery, but it is still something of many questions, an issue of many questions.
And that's okay. So the way you want to look at, so I'm going to take some, you know, insights from the startup world, right? Because that's basically a startup, right, that you're talking about. So my friend Steve Blank, who you might know, who's launched the whole kind of testing movement, how do we test business models? We launched the business model movement, if you want, or scaled it. So he likes to say, what you really need to measure is how long can you survive? Like, how much cash are you burning? So if it doesn't, you know, if you can continue, it doesn't matter if you launched, if it's not going to, you know, cost you so much that you're going to go bankrupt. So it'll take you time, right? So there are always two aspects that you look at in an experiment. How much is it going to cost you? How long is it going to take? And you always want to first ask, can I learn faster? And can I learn cheaper? Okay. Now, if you have all the time of the world and you have all the money of the world and you're not in a hurry, you can go and launch it, right? It's going to be fine and so on. But if there's no financial risk to you, a big financial risk, it's actually the best thing to do is to launch it, right? So I do think that's not necessarily bad per se, but what you then really want to do while you launched is, what do we really need to learn in this phase to make adaptations, right? Okay, so we want to learn about monetization. Okay, well, let's try some things. And then you try to figure out how can you test that as quickly as possible. So launching per se is not a bad thing. But launching when it will drive you into bankruptcy, so in the startup world, that means your burn rate explodes, right? You're going to hire 10 developers. Whoa, you're just going to, now you have 1 million expenses. Your burn rate just went through the roof and you're going to have to get more money, etc. So launching per se is not bad. It's bad when it costs you a lot and you learn very little. So I think it's great that you launched. But the question now really is, what's the next thing you urgently need to learn to accelerate the adaptation of your idea? If everything turns out to be fine, you got lucky. If, you know, and that's hopeful. I hope that for all of you, but luck is not a good, traditionally, it's not a good kind of a variable in startups. Luck has never led to things. But the other thing I take away from this, and I really emphasize this, is I heard you say, you know, opera houses and so established players. Don't worry about those. Forget those. And here, again, I'll take my business analogy because that's the world I know, is Jeff Bezos, probably the most successful business person on the planet these days, maybe after Elon Musk, and, you know, you can like them or hate them, doesn't matter. But Jeff Bezos says, he's always said this from the beginning, if we as Amazon focus on the customer while our competitors focus on us, we'll be fine. And the thing you don't want to do is copy what others do, because you don't even know. And think an opera house might have enough money to do stuff that nobody cares about. And you just copied what they just learned makes no sense, because they didn't have a conversation like we're having today. So they're going to build stuff that nobody cares about because they have the money to build stuff. So the real challenge in innovation is actually that organizations that have money, they're at high risk to build stuff nobody wants. So don't even copy organizations that have more money than you, because you're going to risk copying what doesn't work for them. The only thing you need to do is focus on your customers, consumers, sponsors, beneficiaries, whatever you have as a group, and figure out how can you create value for them. Forget the market research, it's irrelevant. The only thing that matters are your customers, your users, your consumers, your sponsors. If you understand them, you'll win, because you will understand about competition through them. You really shouldn't care too much about competition, because competition is irrelevant. No startup, and I'd say no event like yours, has ever died because of competition. Startups or events die for a lack of consumers, customers, or sponsors, right? That's what we need to go for.
That is a very, it's a great encouragement. Thank you. I have one more question. Is that okay if I ask? While we are, like I said, we're very proud of what we have created because it's unique. Now, where do we find the balance of love mark versus value proposition? Because part of what pushed us to launch so fast was to stick to our love mark, and we really were passionate to create this product. Now we are questioning value proposition and how to move forward to make it really tangible.
So as an innovator, entrepreneur, or creator, there's always this vision you have, but what you need to ask yourself is, how do I make that vision real? So you adapt the vision. So you're stubborn on vision, but you're very adaptive and iterative on the steps to get there. So, you might have a vision of how your event should look like, but, at the end of the day, you're going to figure out what business model do you need for your event to survive more than a year. And there you're going to adapt your value proposition and business model all the time. Here's the thing that, that happens in impact organizations. Let's say, people want to change the world, say alleviate, poverty in a country, or they want to work on sustainability, or maybe some of you want to, boost the arts. So you need to put then a design constraint. Where are you not willing to compromise, right? So that's okay, but you call that design constraints. So typically, again, I'll take an example from the business world, and it might not actually be the question you asked, but just quickly, and then you'll tell me where I went wrong. So Paul Polman from Unilever, who was actually at the Drucker Forum, I think 2 years ago or so, maybe even last year. So he brought sustainability into Unilever, and that became a constraint for everything they did, their entire portfolio. So they would not invest in any businesses, they would transform businesses that didn't have the sustainability aspect. So you might have a certain dream of how your event should be, and you will draw the line of, if the event is not going to have this and this, we're going to kill it, right? We're not going to do it. And sometimes that might be, oh, we don't want to use sponsors. Could be, right? Some people draw the line there. So I think you need to take that dream, make the design constraints, and then within the design constraints, you adapt the value proposition and business model all the time. The tip I'd give you is, to all of you, don't focus only on the value proposition. Try to figure out, could you create a better business model as well? And I'll give you a silly example since we talked about the iPad. Most people don't know that when Steve Jobs launched the iPod, that everybody saw product strategy, technology strategy. I'm going to launch, the iPod, 1,000 songs in a pocket, which was hard to do. What most people don't know is it was actually a business model strategy. He wanted everybody to put their music, legally or illegally acquired, onto the iPod, into iTunes, because once you would put all your music into that, it would be hard to switch. So behind the whole strategy of getting people to put the music onto the iPod was a very simple strategy. If I can lock them into my system, they're going to come back and buy iPods. And that's the reason why the goal was never to sell more music. He didn't care about selling music per se. What he cared about was locking in customers so they would come back and buy iPods, right? So in your world, you need to get the value proposition right. But success, long-term success, will often come from the right business model. Is there something recurring that locks your customers in so they will come back? Is there something that makes it more scalable? Is there something that you could do for others? We call this opportunity creators in our last book, The Invincible Company, something that you could do so others want to sell your event, right? So there are all those kind of business model aspects that are underused in startups in general, in innovation in general. So while of course you need to get the value proposition right, don't neglect the fun stuff you could do to create a better business model.
And that's fascinating. And
Absolutely.
Lava and Jenna there and all of us there, can we discuss a bit business models for festivals like the nexTus Festival or the Birdfoot Festival? Yeah. Except for, we have some sponsors, we have some private donors and some ticket holders. Yeah, that's kind of the business model we currently have in the classical music world. What could it be?
So I don't know, right? I'm the last one you would want to ask. But what I do think is you need to test the value proposition for each, right? So sometimes people say, oh, my value proposition is the event. That's not true, right? So the value proposition for music lovers is the music that they will get and the emotions it creates, okay? What's the value proposition to sponsors? I'll push it, right? It's not that extreme, right? But the value proposition to sponsors, they don't care about the music. What do they care about? That they can actually position their brand and potentially sell something, right? So that's a different value proposition. It's the same event, but the value proposition is different. And then, we might take, I don't know, whatever other thing, so you need to really make explicit the value proposition for each different customer segment. And maybe even you have different types of music lovers and there's a different value proposition for each. And maybe there's something there, right? So take the freemium model. I've always been fascinated by the freemium model. And I'm not saying, I'm just going to show my ignorance of festivals in general. But if you take, in my doctoral dissertation, I actually did study a festival, which was the Montreux Jazz Festival. And the way you want to look at it is, it's almost like a subsidizing model, and you might understand this intuitively, but for me it was, wow, okay, that's a surprise. So the way festivals like the Montreux Jazz Festival work is, there's a lot of free, because that will attract a large amount of people. And the reason they do free is to attract people, and then they earn a ton of money. For a long time, they actually earned money on the consumption of food and beer and whatever and drinks, because they created a digital currency. Okay, back then already a currency. It was actually physical currency, but it was digitally tracked. A physical currency where every single stand, which they didn't operate, had to use their currency, and they would take a cut of the consumption. So it's a very sophisticated model, right? So you want to think of these things where they had a core event, people would pay. But that was actually not the core of the whole business model. The core of the business model then was free events around it. And with those two things, paid events, free events, they would attract a mass of people. And then their main revenue making machine would then come from consumption, not from ticket sales, right? So that's the way festivals often work. And then in particular, free festivals, that's the only way they work, because they don't even sell tickets. So that's what we call the subsidizing model, right? So you want to play with these different models. And again, I don't know if any of this could make sense in your context, but you want to be creative. And you definitely don't want to think about what has been done. You want to think, the question is, what could be done? And then of the 20 ideas you have, one might work. But the question is, what could be done? So that's the cool thing. And that's why I, thought it'd be great if I could talk to you, because I think it's exciting that you're all exploring new stuff. It's the what could be done, right?
It almost sounds like a movie theater business model. It's the same thing, seems like.
Correct, yeah. Or, you know, think of it, so there's interesting other models that are emerging. You know, there are more and more stores that are mixed, and this is a silly idea, right? So I'm not saying this is what you should do, but, you know, think of those mixed models. So many stores now are cafes, not really good at during the pandemic. Most stuff is closed, right? But they realized that, okay, how do you get traffic is, you know, by selling people drinks. And how do you, you know, sell clothes? Well, if you get a lot of traffic, right? And there's something to that physical space. So the question is always, are there different things you could put together so they become an arena? And I think the biggest limitation to our imagination is we think in categories. So I'll give you again, silly business example. If you take Apple, you can't put Apple in a category anymore. They make phones, that's how they earn most money, but they also make software, right? They make computers. They run the biggest, the most lucrative app store on the planet. So you can't put them in a category anymore. It's the business model, which is the unit of analysis. Or if you take Amazon, it's an e-commerce firm. They do logistics, and they sell their whole infrastructure with Amazon Web Services to the biggest banks and pharmaceutical companies. Why does that make sense? Because the business model at the center is what drives it all. So what you want to think of is break out of the traditional categories of classical music and bring stuff together that nobody's ever brought together before. Not for the sake of differentiation, but because it could make sense. Right, so again, we don't mix enough. We don't think about breakthrough models because we think in categories. And the way, you know, you want to think of it is unlearn your category first. Forget how things are done, and that will unlock the biggest potential you can imagine. And then the question is, what could be? What could be?
Wonderful, wonderful. Jenna.
Hello, thank you, Alex. I've had such a great time starting to get familiar with your work, and have found especially, you know, a lot to sort of chew over, but both with the business model, but also with the value proposition model. And I was quite pleased to see that your second book was about the value proposition and audience relationship, because that's exactly sort of where I got stuck in trying to map out some of the things I'm doing and involved with on the business model framework. So that was slightly reassuring. And I guess my question is a little bit philosophical, but I think it has to do with this idea of a subsidized model. It may have to do something with the freemium model. I'm not sure yet, because I think all of us here feel that the classical music industry that we have, you know, been educated in and come up in is in the middle of a radical change of some sort. None of us really know where it's going. All of us are in this process of experimenting and poking at and seeing how could it be better, especially for musicians and for everyone. And for me, one point I've come back to a lot, which is one of the sticky points that I felt was I wasn't quite able to reconcile in looking at what we do with a business model format, is coming up with a language to talk about sort of a non-monetary value. And I know there's a lot of talk in the business world and around experiences and experiential things. So in a way, this is the closest parallel. But, you know, if you just simply looked at, for example, the festival I run, or probably most of our careers at this point with the business model canvas, the revenue streams are dwarfed by the costs, and we should really just give up and go home. And yet, you know, we all know that there's such value in this sort of artistic experience, and it's very difficult to talk about this in monetary terms. You know, that value that's transferred when you hear a great concert and the way that your life is enriched. And our, you know, basic value proposition as artists and musicians is we're going to help you make sense of your existence, right, in the world as a human being, by relating it to the existence of other people who might have lived hundreds of years ago or might live today, and show you that you're actually not alone. This is our sort of core fundamental value proposition. But given, I mean, there's a lot of factors we could talk about that we don't really have time with. I mean, you know, the recording industry and the advent of streaming services and their business models, which have sort of preyed on the visibility desire of musicians, you know, and now most of us put out a recording and expect really to make nothing, maybe pennies, which is kind of criminal. And all of us are looking at how can we shift this around and talk about the value we do in a way that it becomes possible to support ourselves so we can actually make the art. Because right now, I think a lot of us are finding that so much time is going into the, you know, the model and trying to just keep the business model at a staying afloat. And how do we move beyond this so we can really create the value we're good at, which is the art. And this is quite a sticky point. And my instinct is that we need to figure out how to communicate the value we do and find a way that society and perhaps our communities find a sort of new sort of social contract that might not be a direct one-to-one linear. I'm very fascinated with this idea of a gift triangle, and I don't know if that's something you're familiar with, to make it possible for us to keep doing what we're doing and properly fund it. Can you talk about this idea of sort of non-monetary value?
So, yes.
Does it make sense?
Well, of course, right? But so I'm trying to see how I'm going to answer to not be too brutal. I'll put it this way. It's a very egoistic point of view, right? To a certain extent of anybody in any domain saying the world needs to change so I can do what I want to do, okay? So again, I'm being deliberately provocative. Because it doesn't just go for musicians, it goes for Trump voters in the US, right? See how elegantly I just compared you to, but you know, it's for anybody. So we all hate change. And I'll put it with that, right? So frame it like we actually need to figure out, somebody needs to figure out how to make this possible, or we're all gonna have to change. It's as simple as that in whatever domain we're in, right? And you might say, well, you know, classical music is more noble and there's this, you know, 100 years of experience, and sure, but, and I'm not contesting that, but the problem is somebody's going to have to pay for it at the end of the day, right? So that challenge won't go away. Now, the way you want to probably look at it is in this whole community, who are the people who are better at the, you know, experimentation part to figure out a model that could work? Because you know, not all of us can be a Roger Federer. Like we can train as much as we want. We're not going to be like, and you know, I can't play any instrument. I could try as hard as I want to. Maybe Ben Zander would say something else. One of my favorite, you know, thinkers. But so the way we would want to look at it is we still need to figure out a model that's going to make this work. And yes, it's not, you know, the task of all of the musicians. It's the task of those who are more passionate about that maybe business aspect or making it work. And the reason I'll frame it like that is because the most unlikely things can happen when the right minds try to figure it out. So in music, and again, it's not classical music, and you'll maybe see the negative twist to this as well, but there was a huge wave of piracy when digital started. And then comes Steve Jobs and actually figures out a way to get millions of people to pay for music. Or now with Spotify, you know, it started out, and again, we might discuss, you know, who's ripping off who. I'd say it's the record labels, it's not Spotify. Spotify actually has very little margin to do anything because they're you know, victims of the labels. But Spotify from the start said, we want to make music as accessible as possible. They worked with you know, subscription, they worked with advertising, and they started to get millions of people to pay for music, while piracy could give it to us for free. Think of it, right? So I think we need to ask ourselves, what could we do to get back on track, to make it possible for classical music? And I'm pretty sure we'll figure it out. Somebody will figure it out. So the task is, I think, to create a movement that is really, you know, like you're doing actually, that really focuses on the business model. So rather than saying, this has to happen and we need to convince people, I don't think you can convince anybody of anything. The only thing that you can do is create a movement where somebody in the community is going to figure it out and unlock value for everybody else, so we can all live from what we enjoy doing, right? I'm the first who said, I want to do what I want to do, and that's why I became an entrepreneur. I'm unemployable because that's why I needed to create my own business. And I think somebody in the art, in the classical music, is going to figure out some models that work. Hopefully it's some of you, because you're passionate about it and good at it, because it's not enough to be passionate. It's actually super hard. And, you know, over time, I think somebody's going to figure it out. So very long answer, because I didn't know how to answer, but I do believe you're never going to be able to convince people. I think it goes back to, let's figure out what are the jobs, pains, and gains of the different stakeholders in this space, from governments to sponsors to actual music lovers and maybe subsegments of music lovers. And what's the model we could create, right? Maybe it's a freemium model where millions of people are going to get this for free, and there's a small amount of real music lovers, billionaires, I don't know, who would be willing to sponsor certain things. But I think we need to figure out that what it could be, and we'll see multiple models. I think we just need to have more people unlearning the old model, which is broken and it doesn't work anymore. And I think the danger is to stay stuck with the old model and not accepting that the world needs to be changed and we can shape the world, right? So, you know, I think Steve Jobs had a lot of bad sides, but one of the good sides is he always said, you know, you can shape the world around you, right? There's nothing holding us back, right? It's up to us. And it's not about convincing people, it's about creating those models that could work. And that's why, you know, I was fascinated about your project and I was really excited to join. It's rare that I do this because I'm going under in terms of things to do, but it's really fun. It's really amazing what you're all doing. And I believe one of you is going to figure it out. That's the way forward. I wouldn't try to convince. I'd try to figure out what's the value proposition and business model that's going to make this work. Don't try to convince people. Try to learn, deeply understand the different stakeholders. Maybe it's even governments, but there's a different framing for governments. Not the old way, there's a new way maybe, right? So yeah, that's a very long answer because I don't have one.
No, I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your provocation, because I'm not really trying to say, oh, everyone should like this. I think in my mind, you know, good music is good music, whether or not it's made by a classical musician or by someone else.
Yeah.
And, you know, as classical musicians, we're competing more for our audience time actually with just, you know, Netflix or something than other genres of music. So it's really
100%.
Fascinating. And I think what a lot of us, I'm sure I can speak for some others here, have found is there's actually quite a deep hunger for music that we're sensing. And I think we're all sensing this, especially at the end of this year. But that the current models are really not working, and the current models are burning out our organizations more than they're feeding it. So we're really grappling with this. So your testing ideas are wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
And let me, you know, again, just to give you kind of one thing that the pandemic has unleashed. And again, I'm not saying this is the model for classical music, but I've seen this really work for musicians around the world because they lost all the gigs in, you know, bars and pubs if it comes to popular music. Well, guess what? They had to go online. And here's the surprising thing. The paying audience actually increased. So I'll give you a silly example. For every one of our master classes, we pay a musician for 3 days to be there, right? So from an individual model point of view, I'm not talking about orchestras and all that, but from an individual musician point of view, I think the pandemic was a blessing because it opened up a lot more revenue opportunities than ever before. Because now all of a sudden, people who do events, even meetings, they're up to how can we spice up our meetings? And again, I'm not saying this is a solution, but just showing you that these little things, you know, happen. And I'd say that the pandemic might actually be that spark that could lead us to rethink some of the fundamental assumptions. the best innovators always question the most fundamental assumptions, right? So maybe, you know, rather than charging small ticket prices, what if, you know, you got to, you know, sell your event for $1 billion, right? So just think of unexpected things and what, you know, what would need to be true for this crazy idea to work, and then you go out and test it. I'd throw all of the assumptions in the past overboard and start from scratch. You know, if we'd really wanted to make this work, like what would need to be true? What could we do? Rather than what could work, ask what could we do if we have crazy dreams, and then test and adapt and test and adapt. That's how entrepreneurship works. And then 90 ideas are going to fail, but one is going to unlock this for, you know, generations maybe of musicians. So I can only encourage you to throw away the old models.
Can I just, I just have a quick comment writing on what you just said, that it seems to me that the CEO of Patreon, Jack Conte, is a perfect example of what you're talking about, because he seems to have found the model that you're saying. He himself is a musician, and he was looking for solutions, and this company is growing exponentially and providing a platform for other artists and musicians. Quick tail end of the question that Jenna brought up, and you also made a comment about creating your own world, your own reality. Where do you see the element of education coming into this entire picture? Do you think it's valuable?
When you say education, what do you exactly mean? If maybe can sharpen that question a little bit.
Right, education of the things that are maybe not immediately visible as a value to general public, just because they're either not accustomed or not educated enough, or didn't grow up in a certain kind of environment. Sort of to go with what Jenna started talking about.
Education about classical music, you mean?
Yes.
So again, look, I think it's back to the value proposition, right? Deeply understanding people. So, you know, early on, actually in the Netherlands, people used the business model canvas in cultural space in general. And, you know, I've always been fascinated how bad museums are at creating, you know, fun experiences. Museums in general, right? So not talking about music at all. And, you know, I have kids and I can't bring them to, well, now they won't go anymore. They're teenagers, but I couldn't bring them to a museum because it was, even for me, it was boring. Like, I'm not going to force my kids to do something really boring. And only very few museums went into more creative, you know, experiences. So I think it's sometimes a lack of imagination, or thinking, oh, we need technology and technology is expensive to create a great museum experience. No, like you can, there are 1,000 other ways. It's just a problem that, and here I'm generalizing, right? That people who are running these museums, I will say many of those that I met are very ideological, and they say, no, but you know, we're providing cultural value. Kids better understand this is important. Well, I don't think they have kids themselves, right? So while I think you're right, you know, yes, of course, there's educational value. Let's look at a different angle and you know, go away from the ideology and just say, people don't care. And, you know, the Ed Zander approach maybe is then, okay, well, let's not say it's tragedy and whatever. But I do think just kind of forgetting that for a moment and just ask, okay, let's brainstorm. What could we do to get people interested? Right? And not assume that there is value there, but ask, how could we, you know, create value? I would always go, as an entrepreneur, you always have to start from, how could we create value? And then the reality will hit you in the face. I mean, look, the number one task of any innovator and entrepreneur is to look stupid 1,000 times a day until you look smart. And if we were, you know, convinced we're smart, we're never going to succeed. Right, so we have to actually be very humble and ask, how could we, how could we, how could we? And we'll get it wrong 1,000 times. And same with the educational value. I'm sure but then prove me how, right? Like, how is that really creating value? So I'm being a bit tough here in the sense that I almost want to unlock you, because you know, the world is how it is today and you're not going to change it. So you better ask, how could you make a difference, right? And that is not by believing in what you believe to a certain extent, but taking your big vision. Okay, I want, you know, more people to listen to classical music. I want more people to be able to live from classical music. That's a vision, that's a belief. Great, you need that. But then the question is, how can I figure out the value propositions and business models to turn that vision into reality? And what never works is just to stick to the vision. So I had a co-founder once. He said, Alex, you have a vision, go to the doctor, right? So, and Steve Blank says there's a fine line between vision and hallucination. So I do believe we need to force ourselves, right, to be humble and go back to could we? And again, it's a tough game. And I think you are indeed in a space, just like impact investment, where we want to create more value than just money, right? It's not about the money. And I get that, but that's a design constraint, right? You want 1 million people to earn money from classical music. That's a design constraint. That's your objective. How are you going to make it work? That's what I'm interested in, right? So it's what you're telling me is nothing more than a design constraint. I want to educate 1 million people about the value of classical music. Great, that's a beautiful vision. How are you going to make it work, right? So you can have that vision and put it as a design constraint. And the only way you can succeed is if you figure out a value proposition or value propositions and a business model to make that work. That's the reality check. And I think that's just, you know, what I learned from entrepreneurship. It's not about the money. It's about creating value for customers and the organization. And when you're in the impact space, somebody's going to have to pay the bill. So the question is, how are we going to do that? And I think it's the same, what you're talking about is the same in what I'm really passionate about is impact investing when it comes to things like poverty alleviation. It's the same thing. Of course, we want to alleviate poverty and it has to be done. Like from a moral point of view, there's no doubt. But you know, we can stick to the moral high ground, or we can try to figure out business models that will harmonize impact and value creation, right? So we need to just deal with the reality. We have a vision, we have a design constraint. How are we going to make it work? And I'm sure that the brilliant minds you are, you're going to figure it out.
Thank you so much. Raj?
If we have time, I have just one more question. Very interesting question about education, because that's related to the project I'm thinking of doing at the moment with my ensemble, which is we are creating a subscription of semi-educational, so edutainment model that particularly addresses or gives audience an insight into what is the work that goes on behind, and that they will get to know this music better, because the issue with classical music or the sort of music we do is that it is basically quite complex. And, you know, in my experience, I don't like a piece when I hear it first, but eventually I get to like it more. I also have such an experience with wine, which I love, and some tea and some coffee, which I love. So, you know, these are not new questions. And in working through the canvas and trying to come up with the model customer, we've run into an issue that there are basically two crude sets. The ones who consume music because they want to be challenged, and because they want to learn, and because they want to grow. And another who consumes music because they want to forget the world, because they want to be entertained, they want to be emotionally touched. Of course, there are overlaps, but messages are slightly different. And in your business of educating businesses, I'm sure you've also come, you know, across these issues of what was identified 300 years ago by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach as the Kenner and the Liebhaber, the connoisseurs and the amateurs. They want different things. How do you navigate this in terms of communication? Because they will both need to be communicated to differently.
So you know, in very crude business terms, that's called segmentation, right? Customer segmentation. And then you need to ask yourself, do I create 2 value propositions, one for each that addresses each, you know, each customer segment's jobs, pains, and gains? The advantage of that is, you know, you'll create more value for each customer segment. You'll have a challenge in terms of communication, monetization, etc. But that's usually, you know, it's a very strong approach. The other approach is looking exactly at that overlap, the same, you know, which ones are the same jobs, pains, and gains that both have, and that you'll be able to create one value proposition that just addresses that intersection. And then you design your entire communication based on that intersection, right? So those are kind of the 2 broad directions you could take, right? But then the decision you make depends on several factors. One is the complexity that you're creating. The other one is monetization. So you might want to separate, because one you can monetize, the other one you can't. The size of the customer segments. Again, back to freemium model, maybe one will get it for free because they're not willing to pay. One will pay, it's a smaller segment. All those kind of things are then considerations that you need to take into account to either split the value proposition to make it specific to each, or only look at the intersection. And that's a business choice or a design choice that you have to make based on all of the other variables, right? Complexity, communication, monetization, etc. So that's, you know, in the business world, how I would answer that particular question. And can you figure out, and it's not necessarily thinking just solution. The way I like to look at it, if you know the value proposition, Ken, is right, we have the customer profile. So if you look at jobs, pains, and gains, you'll often find very surprising overlaps of the jobs, pains, and gains. So just, you know, as surprising, the iPhone took off across all different kinds of segments. Why? Because they address similar jobs, pains, and gains. It was very surprising, right? Because the typical kind of segmentation, you know, demographics and so really fall apart for many of the new value propositions. Same with Spotify, right? It's kind of crazy which different segments they were able to address, because they look at the same jobs, pains, and gains, which is, you know, has to do with often about the pains, about finding music, you know, paying for music, all of that. Just so they came up with one solution that worked for a large variety. But then in the case of Spotify, they clearly, and it's a completely different segmentation than the one you're talking about. But in the case of Spotify, that's how the freemium model works. They were very aware there's a group of younger consumers, they will never pay for Spotify because they don't even have the money. So they have a free model for them, and they would monetize. Now it turns out that actually they have one of the best conversion rates on the planet when it comes to subscriptions, but they could only figure that out through experimentation. So it might not be the exact answer to your question, but that's kind of the I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Very helpful. I mean, one of the challenges in analyzing, especially the connoisseur segment, is that the gains, so they are smaller number, and therefore they even if they pay more, there is a much bigger limit on growth. But the gains are either more intangible in that they talk and people believe them, and then eventually we get a booking, or that they are concert promoters who will only book us in 5 years. These long range things are very difficult to test. How do businesses address these bigger gains but are more distant in the future?
Well, so I think that the way to look at it is maybe, again, going back to fact. So in my case, for our business, we work with innovators in established companies, but innovators have no legitimacy or power. So we're never selling to them. We're selling to CEOs and senior leaders of companies like Colgate, MasterCard, and so. So what we would go and look at is how in the past have they bought similar types of services, right? And then try to figure out, is there anything, that we can connect to? So basically past behavior can predict future behavior. So rather than asking them, would you, could you, you know, you look at any of their past behavior. Do they have a budget today to spend on that kind of stuff? What's the usual time frame from discovering a talent towards, you know, acquiring a talent, that kind of stuff. So you look at the metrics they use today, the gains, you know, how do they measure success today? What are some of the quantifications? So I think just trying to make everything you learn around customers as evidence-based, as fact-based, and as number-based as possible is best, right? You know, have they ever immediately, you know, acquired a talent? What is the usual time frame it takes to hire people, etc.? So you just go deep into the data by asking holes into their bellies. And the more quantitative you can make it, the better you can then adapt your solution to that.
Alex, thank you so much. Yeah, it was an amazing almost 1.5 hours. Backwards, forwards, creating so much really of interest of us and something which was really valuable. Thank you so much, Alex. It really meant a lot to us.
I appreciate that you invited me. I mean, it's a very rare opportunity for me to speak to such an audience. And all I can encourage you is really, you know, throw away the old mental models. And I think you're already doing that, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be working like this. But, you know, the biggest lesson for me as an entrepreneur was also, you get better at these things over time, right? Just like you don't wake up and you become a world-class musician. It's actually the same in innovation and entrepreneurship. You know, it takes years until you get really good at this. So you have to, you know, if you take the startup world, people see the successful people on the cover of a magazine. What they don't realize is all of these people, many of these people who had success, they first played a small role in a startup where they were hired, they were a developer, then they become head of marketing. And before they actually create an organization, they've done 100 things and they've learned 1,000 things not to do, right? So what you're doing is experimenting, and you'll just get better at this over time. So just like, you know, I tried I only got to the recorder, right? That's as far as I got. And I was forced to do that. But, you know, in terms of learning music, I was more into sports. You don't get good at this overnight. It's the same with innovation and entrepreneurship. So all I can do is encourage you to get up again, try it again, and never lose courage. You do sometimes need to stop. So I wouldn't say never give up. Some ideas need to be killed, right? That's okay. But continue to innovate. And if I could give you a little bit of that experience, I'd be super happy. Don't hesitate to reach out through Bernard. I'm sure we're going to keep the contact. Happy to do this again in the future.
Thank you
so much.
It's such a privilege to have you as part of our new festival. And Bernhard, thank you so much again for making this happen.
Thank
Cool.
you, Alex.
Have a good one. Good luck with your venture. With your ideas.
Thank you very much.
Have a good evening.
you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.